What if I told you that the grandmother of Europe, the woman who gave her name to an entire era of supposed moral virtue, was actually one of the most controversial and problematic monarchs in British history? I'm talking about Queen Victoria. And today we're diving deep into 10 shocking facts about her that will completely change how you see this so-called virtuous queen. Trust me, by the end of this video you'll understand why her own family tried to cover up these stories for over a century. But before we shatter your illusions about Victorian morality, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're about to uncover some seriously uncomfortable truths that your history teacher definitely didn't tell you. Queen Victoria ruled Britain for 63 years from 1837 to 1901. She's remembered as the symbol of moral propriety, family values, and imperial grandeur. Streets, cities, and even entire countries bear her name. But here's the thing, the real Victoria was nothing like the sanitized version we've been taught. Today, we're peeling back the layers of royal propaganda to reveal the woman behind the crown. And I'm warning you now, some of these facts are going to make you seriously uncomfortable. So grab your tea, settle in, and prepare to have your mind blown. Let's start with something that might shock you. Queen Victoria was essentially a drug addict. And I'm not talking about the occasional glass of wine with dinner. Victoria regularly consumed what was called Marana tincture, a powerful opium-based medicine that was supposedly prescribed for her menstrual cramps. But here's where it gets interesting. She didn't just take it occasionally. Historical records show she consumed it regularly, often in doses that would be considered dangerous even by 19th century standards. The royal physician's notes, which were kept secret for decades, reveal that Victoria often complained of withdrawal symptoms when she couldn't access her opium. She described feeling restless and irritable without it, classic signs of opium dependence. But here's the kicker. While Victoria was getting high on opium in her palace, she was simultaneously supporting the opium wars in China, where British forces were literally forcing Chinese people to accept opium imports. The irony is staggering. She was addicted to the very substance her empire was using to subjugate an entire nation. Think about that for a moment. The woman who represented moral authority for an entire empire was dependent on drugs, while her government was devastating China with the same substance. It's hypocrisy on an imperial scale. Now, let's talk about John Brown. And trust me, this story gets messy fast. John Brown was Victoria's Scottish servant, and their relationship was so inappropriate that it became the scandal of the century. We're talking about a relationship so controversial that Victoria's own children were embarrassed by it. Brown had access to the Queen that even her own family didn't have. He called her by her first name, something that was absolutely unheard of in Victorian society. He walked into her private chambers without knocking, gave her orders, and she obeyed them. The British press started calling her Mrs. Brown instead of Your Majesty. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable. There's substantial evidence that their relationship was romantic, possibly even sexual. Victoria wrote him passionate letters that her children later destroyed. She commissioned a life-size statue of him. When he died, she went into mourning that rivaled her grief for Prince Albert. The most damning evidence? Victoria insisted on being buried with John Brown's photograph and a lock of his hair. She chose to take mementos of her servant to her grave instead of additional items from her husband or children. Her obsession with Brown was so intense that her own son, the future King Edward VII, had to stage what was essentially an intervention. The royal family was terrified that Victoria would actually marry Brown, which would have been one of the biggest scandals in British royal history. Here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. Queen Victoria, one of the most powerful women in world history, was viciously opposed to women's rights. She called the women's suffrage movement a mad, wicked folly that would destroy family life. She wrote letters describing women who wanted the vote as dangerous and unwomanly. This is coming from a woman who literally ruled an empire. But the hypocrisy gets even worse. Victoria believed that women should be submissive to men and stay in the domestic sphere, while she herself commanded armies, made international treaties, and controlled the finances of multiple nations. She had power that most men could only dream of, yet she actively worked to deny other women even basic rights. In 1870 she wrote, "The Queen is most anxious to enlist everyone who can speak or write to join in checking this mad, wicked folly of women's rights with all its attendant horrors." She was literally using her platform as the most powerful woman in the world to keep other women powerless. Think about the cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position. She was proving every single day that women were capable of leadership, intelligence, and authority, while simultaneously arguing that women were inferior and should have no rights. Victoria had 9 children, and she was an absolutely terrible mother to almost all of them. And I'm not talking about being a little strict or emotionally distant. I'm talking about genuine neglect and psychological abuse. She described pregnancy as an occupational hazard and called newborn babies frog-like creatures. She often ignored her children for months at a time, leaving them with servants while she focused on her government duties or her personal interests. But here's the most disturbing part. Victoria played favorites in the most toxic way possible. She lavished attention on her youngest child, Beatrice, while openly expressing disgust for several of her other children. She wrote in her diary that she found some of her children repulsive and disappointing. Her son Leopold, who had hemophilia, was treated particularly cruelly. Instead of showing compassion for his medical condition, Victoria often wrote about how his illness was inconvenient and embarrassing to the royal family. She blamed him for his own genetic condition and made him feel ashamed of something he couldn't control. The psychological impact on her children was severe. Several of them struggled with mental health issues throughout their lives, and their letters to friends reveal deep feelings of inadequacy and abandonment. Her daughter Vicky wrote to a friend, "Mama's coldness is something I will never understand or forgive." When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria's grief was genuine and understandable, but what she did next was absolutely unforgivable. She weaponized her grief to control and manipulate her entire family. Victoria forced her daughters to stay with her instead of returning to their own families. She emotionally blackmailed them, saying that if they left her, they would be abandoning their father's memory. She made them feel guilty for wanting to have their own lives. But here's the most manipulative part. She dressed her daughters in mourning clothes for years and made them participate in elaborate daily rituals to honor Albert's memory. She turned her children into professional mourners and refused to let them move on with their lives. Her daughter Alice wrote in her diary, "Mama has made us prisoners of Papa's death. We are not allowed to laugh, to enjoy life, or to think of the future. We exist only to serve her grief." Victoria kept Albert's room exactly as it was when he died, with servants laying out fresh clothes and hot water every single day for over 40 years. She forced her family to participate in this elaborate fantasy that Albert was still alive, and if they refused, she would punish them with days of silent treatment and emotional manipulation. Now we need to talk about Victoria's attitudes toward race and empire. And this is where things get really uncomfortable. Victoria referred to her Indian subjects as her brown children and consistently described them as childlike and incapable of self-governance. She supported policies that devastated India, including famines that killed millions of people, while simultaneously collecting massive wealth from Indian resources. But here's what's particularly disturbing. Victoria had access to detailed reports about the suffering her policies caused in India, and she consistently chose to ignore them. She knew that British policies were causing mass starvation, but she prioritized imperial profits over human lives. Her letters reveal casual racism that would be shocking even by 19th century standards. She described African people as savage and barely human. She supported the expansion of slavery in some British territories while publicly claiming to oppose it. Most damning of all, when the Indian Rebellion of 1857 occurred, Victoria supported brutal retaliation that included mass executions and collective punishment. She wrote that the rebels deserved no mercy and should be made an example of to prevent future uprisings. Victoria publicly presented herself as a devout Christian and the defender of the faith. But privately, she was skeptical of religion and often mocked religious practices. She wrote in her private diary that she found church services tedious and meaningless. She described communion as theatrical nonsense and questioned whether Jesus actually performed miracles. This is coming from the woman who was literally the head of the Church of England. But the hypocrisy gets worse. While publicly supporting Christian morality, Victoria protected and promoted people in her court who were involved in scandals that violated everything Christianity taught. She knew about affairs, financial corruption, and other moral failings among her courtiers, but chose to ignore them when it was convenient. She also showed favoritism toward ministers who told her what she wanted to hear, regardless of their actual religious credentials or moral character. Several of her favorite religious advisors were later exposed as frauds or involved in financial scandals. Victoria used her royal power in petty, vindictive ways that would be considered abuse of power by any modern standard. She maintained detailed lists of people who had slighted her, even in minor ways, and would seek revenge years later. She once had a servant fired because he sneezed during a formal dinner. She banned certain foods from the royal household because they reminded her of people she disliked. But here's the most disturbing example. Victoria used her influence to destroy the careers of politicians and public figures who criticized her, even when their criticism was legitimate and constructive. She would use her connections to have them excluded from social events, denied business opportunities, and even blocked from receiving honors they had earned. Her vindictiveness extended to her own family members. When her son Edward married someone she didn't approve of, she spent years trying to sabotage their marriage and make their lives miserable. She spread rumors about her daughter-in-law and tried to turn other family members against her. Victoria was obsessed with controlling her image and participated in elaborate cover-ups that would make modern politicians blush. She paid journalists to write favorable stories about her and had negative stories suppressed through threats and bribes. She controlled access to information about the royal family so tightly that most of what the public knew about her was essentially propaganda. But here's the most shocking part. Victoria ordered the destruction of thousands of documents that would have revealed uncomfortable truths about her reign. Letters, diaries, government documents, and personal correspondence were systematically destroyed to protect her reputation. Her children continued this cover-up after her death, destroying even more evidence and creating the sanitized version of Victoria that we've inherited. They literally rewrote history to make their mother look better. And finally, the most disturbing fact of all, Victoria was a classic narcissist who believed that other people existed primarily to serve her needs. She expected constant praise and attention, even for routine activities. She required elaborate ceremonies for everyday events and became furious if she didn't receive what she considered appropriate reverence. But here's what makes this particularly disturbing. Victoria genuinely believed that her personal comfort was more important than the lives of her subjects. She spent enormous amounts of public money on her personal luxuries while people in her empire were dying of preventable diseases and starvation. She once spent more money on a single dress than most of her subjects would earn in their entire lifetimes, and she saw nothing wrong with this. She believed that her royal status made her inherently more valuable than other human beings. So there you have it, 10 controversial facts about Queen Victoria that reveal the woman behind the myth. From drug addiction to racism, from child neglect to imperial hypocrisy, Victoria was far from the moral paragon she's often portrayed as. But here's why this matters today. We still live with the consequences of Victoria's choices. The imperial systems she supported, the attitudes she promoted, and the cover-ups she orchestrated continue to influence our world. Understanding the real Victoria helps us understand how power can corrupt and how historical narratives can be manipulated. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these facts shocked you the most? Are there other historical figures whose reputations you think need to be re-examined? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's have a real conversation about how we remember history. And if you want to see more content that challenges the official narrative about historical figures, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're going to continue digging into the uncomfortable truths that powerful people don't want you to know. Remember, history is written by the winners, but that doesn't mean we have to accept their version of events.